Welcome to the Wild Souls podcast. I'm your host, Kat Mansfield. Together, we will return to our wild instincts, reconnect to our bodies, to our connection to something greater, to the truth of our infinite potential. This podcast is about holding space for the whole spectrum of the human experience as we navigate each of our unique and divine healing journeys and step deeper into our soul's calling. These conversations are meant to be a resource for deep self-inquiry, a guidepost in cultivating an unwavering self-love, and ultimately empower you to create a life so on purpose, so aligned with your authenticity, you can't help but embody your wildest soul. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Wild Souls. Kat here. It has been a minute since I've uploaded content to the podcast. We were in a bit of a portal. We moved houses from Bend out to Sisters. And so anybody who has moved recently, it'd been a while for me, but it is such a send. Holy shit. So I feel like I'm just kind of starting to get grounded again, can finally really commit and devote myself to creating content again on the podcast. So this conversation is actually one I recorded back in the tiny home with Leo Mars, and it's one that I am so excited to finally be sharing. Leo is a transformational guide, a breathwork facilitator, and a futurist. And today's conversation is a deeply expansive dialogue on awakening, identity, and what it means to navigate the paradox of being both human and spirit. So we dive into all things AI and consciousness. I mean, this conversation goes a lot of places, and Leo has so much insight and knowledge to share with us about expanding our consciousness and where we're moving as a collective now with the introduction of AI. So I hope this conversation is stimulating. It definitely was for me. Enjoy. Hello, Leo. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me. Happy to be
Yeah,
here.
I'm excited you're here. It's a really interesting conversation we're about to dive into. And so, why don't we start with a little bit of your background, how you moved from kind of startups and restaurants, hospitality into this deeper realm of transformation and consciousness and awakening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long story. It could probably take a couple of hours if I were to really tell the
Yeah.
story. I was raised in a Christian church and grew up going to private school, memorizing the Bible, pretty
Mm.
much prohibited from really learning a lot of science.
Mm.
Um, I love the Bible. I love the teachings of Christ. But that had I would say probably around the age of 10, I started thinking rationally and asking real questions. That was not received well in the church, real questions about creation and the universe. And that was really challenging for me. I would say on some level that was kind of traumatic for me as a child. I have one recollection of really being shut down by one of my father's best friends. I asked a question that apparently made him uncomfortable. And he really shut it down in a way that was like, had a very tangible effect on my psychology. So I've always felt like super curious about the nature of reality and what's going on here. But it really wasn't nurtured in my younger years. I got an early start in entrepreneurship. And at 12 years old, I started my first business. I actually had a marketing campaign. I had an employee.
Oh,
Yeah,
super early start.
super early. Yeah, I wanted at the time I wanted fish, like pets. So I would spend my profit on fish tanks and new fish and bigger tanks, and
Sweet.
um, that led just kind of one thing to another. It was very natural, and I continued that in my early 20s. Funded a couple of small startups. And at 25, I opened primarily it was like most of our revenue came from alcohol sales. It was a nightclub,
Yeah.
but it was also a 4-star restaurant. I had an award-winning chef and very beautiful space. I always had this natural inclination as a carpenter by trade, to build spaces. So it's kind of in my DNA to build, venues and brick and mortars and bring people into space. When I was 27, 2 years in, and at this time I was living in Alaska, building in Alaska, and kind of like bouncing around between a few different projects. I, I, so I was flying between Alaska and Colorado and running this nightclub that was like one of the, it was best of Denver, top of the town, really kind of like a flashy lifestyle in a way. And it was a very intense contrast, going from the wilderness of Alaska to the center of the city, in the newspaper every other month,
Wow.
kind of bit of like a local celebrity vibe. And I don't know exactly what triggered this, but I had satiated a lot of my like teen desires for recognition and respect and, attracting the opposite sex. And out of nowhere, I was visiting my father in Alaska and I slipped into an altered state in the shower. And the altered state, I now understand is like not like a non-dual experience, or like it was the first time in my life that I had ever experienced thoughtlessness. And in that thoughtlessness, there was no self. There was no local self.
Mm-hmm.
So I essentially like permeated my perspective. So beyond the walls of the bathroom, beyond the walls of the house, beyond the walls of the stratosphere of the earth, I was
Wow.
everywhere.
And prior to this, had you had any practices, any meditation practices, or no? You just
No,
kind of, for all intents and purposes, regular guy, kind of asleep in a way.
absolutely. So
Wow.
regular, like, and so like materialistic and modern, and like all of my values were very typical.
Right. Like in this
I
material world.
very much, yeah.
Mm.
And I had never used psychedelics, never used mushrooms or anything like that that would give me a sense of like there's something other than these ordinary states of consciousness.
Wow.
So it was really kind of struck me by surprise, to say the least. And the following day, I was online. This was in 2009, and I was basically just Googling, like, trying to figure out what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it was like very rational inquiry. It wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't looking into necessarily like spirituality or anything. I was just like, what's going, like, what happened to me?
Am I okay?
Yeah. Am I crazy?
Yeah.
And I found the work of an American philosopher named Ken Wilber. Are you familiar with Ken, or integral
No.
theory, maybe? Okay.
No.
You might really dig integral theory. It's basically, so Ken is now, he's very much at the end of his kind of career. He's written over 30 books, started writing in the late 60s. His first book was called Spectrums of Consciousness. And it was basically, he was an early pioneer in synthesizing Eastern and Western philosophies.
Cool.
In 1996, something called integral theory, that's known as integral theory today, emerged from his work. And in integral theory, it's basically a theory of everything. Essentially, it's an academic theory of everything. And so it holds space for everything: the unnameable, the unknowable, the mystery, mythology, cosmology, systems theory, psychology, everything in a very sophisticated way. And when I first discovered it, I was like, wow, okay, this is intense. I'm going to put this on the shelf. But what I found inside of integral theory is something called states and stages. And it's basically a kind of like a mini framework within the framework. Basically, what it says is that states of consciousness are ever present. They're more or less horizontal. They're innate in our psychology. In fact, they're even kind of implied to be primary. Like Buddha nature is primary. It's in there. You don't have to, evolve yourself to achieve it. And then stages are more vertical. So those are essentially developmental stages of human psychology and cognition and values. And those are in integral, they're considered holarchical. Like you can't skip stages, just like you can't open the aperture of a camera from here to here without going through every stage in between.
Mm-hmm.
You move through these stages in a linear way.
Okay, yeah.
And if you have a state experience, you interpret it through the lens of your stage.
Okay.
And so
yeah.
that was super enlightening for me. I could see like, oh, I'm in spiral dynamics, which again is a model within integral theory. I'm at this like materialistic, egocentric, modern strive drive stage.
Mm-hmm.
Not very flattering. I'm not very evolved. But I'm not crazy, at least. I could have had that experience, and it seems to be legitimate for this model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so essentially you can access any state at any given point, right? Like you're saying, Buddha nature is hardwired within us. It's almost like a remembering that takes place, and then the interpretation, as you're saying, is through the lens of the stage. So in your case, being in that material 3D of the ego kind of place in your journey.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, that I'm excited to learn more about that. Okay, so you found integral theory after this moment of transcendence in the shower.
Yep. Yeah, and for me, that model resonated strongly because I was at rational. So it's a rational model that holds space for the irrational or the purely subjective.
Right.
So this was a really exciting time in my life. In fact, I would say it was probably the biggest like awakening moment.
Totally. It sounds like.
Yeah, it was kind of like the earthquake that shook my city to the ground, more or less. I went home, came back to Denver, and immediately began, and I can only say this in retrospect, but that modern stage began to crumble, and I began to kind of transition into a new stage of development that in spiral dynamics is known as, well, it's essentially identified by the color green, but it's pluralistic. It's transrational. It's postmodern is essentially the stage.
Okay.
So when your lens widens from modern, you become more concerned about the environment, more concerned about other people and equality.
Right. Starting to kind of tune into the interconnectedness of it all.
Yep. But it's also hallmarked by radical pluralism, which is in its own way kind of a bit. It can be a bit of a mutation. Like it's not the end. So when we go, everyone's right or everyone's voice should be heard, we on some level we lose this kind of like thread of meaning in a way. Like we're shifting into a place where if everyone's right through their lens, then nobody's right in a way. There is a perennial, principled, underlying reality that, and this is its own kind of deep dive in itself, the perennial philosophy that is underlying, let's say, if we're talking about religious traditions or wisdom traditions, there's a fundamental truth that all of these traditions are kind of talking about in their own way. So postmodernism is kind of like this is where we have a lot of the nihilism of today and the hedonism and nihilism and loss of meaning, kind of agnostic view of the world. So yeah, I came back to Denver. I started shifting into this new stage of development, postmodern, unbeknownst to me. It was like a month later, it was going to be St. Patrick's Day. And I told my staff, we're going to spend the next month greening the venue. So we're going to
Yeah.
start sourcing locally. We're going to completely re-engineer the menu. We're going to bring in, bamboo cocktail skewers and herbal infused vodkas. And we're going to start composting and recycling. And at the
Everyone's like,
time, this was not, yeah, no, they really were. It wasn't at this point, it was not at all trendy. In fact,
yeah.
I didn't know of another, venue in the city that was doing this.
Hmm.
So we threw a going green party for St. Patrick's Day, and it wasn't cool. It was cool to me, but everyone else is kind of like, this is a lot of
Sounds
work,
cool.
man. We got,
Sounds
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So about 45 days into that, after coming back, I got a phone call from some hoteliers out of New York City and restaurateurs out of New York City, and they basically initiated a sale of the venue. So they were like, "We want to buy your venue," and I took off. Signed the paperwork maybe 2 months after the experience, and took off to South America on a quest.
Cool.
Yeah.
And there, South America is one of the places I was called to early in my awakening as well. It's just there's so much sacred land, so many mystical practices. So tell us
Yes.
about your time there.
Yes. Yeah. Well, honestly, that it was the beginning. I kind of had this very idealistic view of this. I got a one-way flight to Buenos Aires, and I was going to
Mhm.
just pop around. And
Yeah, I did that too.
what
It's
it,
funny.
did you?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
beautiful city.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a electric city. It really is.
mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. So that was, I took a bunch of books, Joe Dispenza and some kind of mystical books and different
Mhm.
things. And I basically just, I did a lot of reading and, on the beach, more or less. So I kind of popped around to a few places and read in the jungle and on the beach for several months. I, I didn't know that I was going to go into a depression. I went into about a 2.5 year deepest depression I've ever been
Mhm.
in. A lot of the stripping away of the false identity and feeling very confused
Mhm.
about who I am.
Yeah.
If I am everything, then essentially I'm nothing from another view. Like,
Mhm.
I'm undefined.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think that's such a important thing to touch on and I don't think everybody has to experience that in their journey or in their spiritual awakening. And I think a lot of people do. I definitely have and even still do in moments when especially after you have, for me, what I experience is like after peak experience where whether it be like a psilocybin experience or just any moment where you see so clearly, you see the
Mm.
interconnectedness so clearly, you see beyond the veils. And there's this kind of like, if I'm everything, and also when I leave this body, if I'm, returning to this state of bliss into to this field of consciousness and oneness, like yes, I'm here for a purpose, and that sounds great, like, and this
Yeah.
isn't really all it's cracked up to be in a way. And there's this kind of um having to make sense of being here and in of this world. At least that's what I experience. So I think that's
Hmm.
important to touch on, is that you may experience that, and it's a part of the awakening. It's a part of it.
Yes, absolutely. And something I've heard you talk about in your podcasts that really intrigued me is the idea of, in a way, like living, and not to be cliche, but like living authentically. Like,
Mhm.
um, what's been useful for me has been in resolving that kind of paradox is like
Mhm.
both are true. The
Yeah.
universe is paradoxical and it's hard to wrap our human brains around,
Mhm.
but we're this human organism with a psyche and a nervous system and a sense of
Mhm.
local I-ness,
Mhm.
and probably more primordially, we are existence. We are,
Mm.
you know, we are energy and intelligence, at least
Mhm.
14 billion years old. And that to just go, okay, I'm both.
Yeah.
Don't necessarily, you don't need to reject the self. In fact, like with Carl Jung, like his whole thing was healthy individuation, right? Self-individuation.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, maybe I can in a way like formulate or design a self that I love, that I'm in love with, and also know that I am actually all that is, or
Right.
spirit.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, that was a really challenging period. It led into this extended depression. I flew back through Colorado to pick up my lady and swoop us up to Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to write a book. I started writing a book, wrote over 100 pages of what I reflected back on as crap. Um, I was going to write a book called The Evolutionary Life that was basically kind of like turning me into a guinea pig, almost like half memoir, half like self-help, more or less,
Okay. Yeah.
through the lens of like kind of taking personal development more into the lens of, being an evolving organism in an evolving
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. I think that
Um,
sounds cool.
yeah, it could have been.
Yeah.
I
Didn't end
gave
up
up.
being. Yeah.
What's that?
It didn't end up being cool.
No, no, no.
No.
And I was studying writing and like really, really putting my all into it, pretty much full
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
at my little cabin in the woods back home in Alaska.
Yeah.
And there was something missing. And I think a lot of what was missing was just maturity and
Mm.
a real depth of understanding of what I was experiencing, and not just a kind of like a, a repeat of what's already out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that, I started studying at around the time that I was giving up on the book. I started studying integral theory through a school out of Canada that's not
Mm.
associated with the philosopher. They're just applying his model. And I went through this 2-year program, flying kind of back and forth between Alaska and Canada, for these kind of intensives. And at the end of this 2-year program, our final kind of like meet as a cohort was in Boulder, Colorado, where essentially Integral was born. Ken used to live in Boulder. He was integral in founding the Naropa University with Trungpa Rinpoche. And essentially, it's like kind of the hub of integral consciousness in the US. So our last meet was there. It was a 1-week intensive. And the last day of that meet, we had a chance to go to Ken's home and kind of sit with Ken and get a lecture and ask questions and whatnot. At that, that when I got up the elevator, all of my other classmates had already taken all the good seats. So I plopped down on the floor in the front of the front row, kind of sitting at the feet of the master or whatever. Um, and it had just had such an impact on my view of the world that I'm not going to sit back there. No,
Yeah.
I just spent the last 3 years listening to this guy for hundreds of hours. So had some books I asked him to sign some books at the end, and I got a phone call from one of his PAs, his personal assistants, that was like, "Hey, do you want to come and hang out with us on Saturday?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "It's just
Yeah.
us, like a couple of Ken's editors and Ken." I was like,
Wow.
"Yeah, yeah, yeah, big." Like I canceled my flight. I
Full
stayed
body,
with
yeah.
friends for a week. Yeah.
Mhm.
And went back. And when I went back, it was just like 4 or 5 of us and Ken. And Ken is just this behemoth of a philosopher. He has had essentially as celebrated a philosopher could have while they're alive, more or less. Just, in fact, you'd probably recognize his face, big, bald, kind of alien looking intellectual guy. So at that meeting, Ken invited me to spend more time there. So I ended
Wow.
up moving back to Denver, kind of happenstance that he happened to live in Denver at the time. Moved back to Denver and spent about a year and a half, my Saturdays for a year and a half, kind of soaking it in with his editors and his PAs. I'm giving you the long version of this story. I want to get to the good part.
Yeah. Well, feel free to skip ahead, but it's a great story, and I'm curious so far, like in this in the development of you essentially at this point, like from your spiritual awakening to this point, what other practices have you developed? Have you found breath work yet? Have
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
developed a
Yeah.
meditation
Yeah.
practice?
Great
Yeah.
question. Yeah. Great question. So I had not long after that awakening in the shower, one of my best friends introduced me to yoga. He was like, "Hey, you got to
Mm.
come check this out." And essentially, at the time, we were just using it as a hangover detox. Like, this is
All
awesome.
right.
Just go in here and sweat it out and feel
Yeah.
better.
Twist and yeah, cleanse
Yeah.
the body.
Yeah. So I got into yoga at the time and haven't stopped. That's a big part of my life still to this day. But it wasn't until probably 14 years later, wow, time flies, that I discovered breath work. It might have been 12 or 13 years later. So in 2017, I discovered breath work. But around that time, I was also going deep with psychedelics. So
Mm.
I had decided I was doing these like pretty much every Friday, Saturday for probably 6 months. I would fast for 24 hours,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would do a heroic dose of either psilocybin or LSD by myself at home,
Cool.
basically in the garden and in the
Uh-huh.
house. And yeah, so that was also happening at that time.
Yeah, let's just put a pin there for a second. I
Yeah.
love just the tool of psychedelics. Psychedelics to me on my spiritual journey have just been a vehicle to transcendence, and especially, complemented by intention and a practice, not just kind of pre-spiritual awakening where you're up in the material world, very immersed in your ego, and then taking a hero's dose and then going back to your life. Not so, but really using them coupled with your practices and with intention. And if there's one like experience or moment, peak experience or peak insight that you are willing to share with us, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, like, for me, a lot of those experiences were about going into my subconscious and
Mm-hmm.
being with the darkness and
Mm-hmm.
confronting the darkness.
Yeah.
I would say probably more than, more often than not, the hallmark of those experiences was being with that darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard. It was really hard because when you're there, usually you can't get away from it. You can't,
Mm-hmm.
turn away. It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I would say that had a lot to do with my early like shadow work, was being
Mm-hmm.
with that, seeing all those
Mm-hmm.
facets of the dark and feeling terror and hopelessness and um, yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, my memories, there's always beautiful things to see in those
Yeah.
states, but it was a
Yeah.
lot of being with the dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. And to be honest, a lot of my experience with psychedelics, there's definitely because I feel like I also about a year ago or maybe 2 years ago, similarly kind of spent not every weekend, but it was like every other week or every 3 weeks. I would also kind of venture off on my own into the woods or on a path hiking and administer myself a hero's dose, maybe a little bit less, but
Hmm.
about like for a little girl was a lot. And
Hmm.
and similarly would just give myself time to sit in the experience. And I haven't met a lot of other people who do that just because I think going into that space by yourself, that it can be extremely intimidating, but also it's just a whole world. It's your whole inner landscape to explore and get to know. And one of the greatest things I've taken away from all of my journeys is that ability to establish an internal safety within myself, like especially
Mm.
within my breath. At any of those moments where you're deep in the shadow, or it starts to feel overwhelming, or you're peaking, and really coming back to the inhale and the exhale, and telling myself, like, I am safe in this body, in this breath, no matter what happens, no matter what my mind like sees or projects or creates, I am safe in this body. And that's been, I think, one of the most foundational lessons that I've taken with me from my work with psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you
Really?
100%. That's, in
Yeah.
fact, I would echo that same thing.
Yeah.
There is so much beauty in those experiences, and in fact, that has been the theme, and how I got really deep into the breath was that, between birth and death, there's breath,
Mm-hmm.
and learning that cycle, that's an expiration and an inspiration, and it's literally
Mm-hmm.
how we're getting energy and transacting with the biosphere
Mm-hmm.
in a big way. And that has been really key for me. I After opening the breathwork studio in 2018, I had a lot of different people coming to the studio and saying, hey, I want to do this class here, or this workshop, or this ceremony, or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I had several, in fact, quite a few really high level elder shamans come through of various medicines, plant medicines and things.
Mm-hmm.
And one in particular, I had already had an experience with bufo, with toad venom,
Mm.
and I had just had one. And this wonderful medicine woman from Avalon, of all places,
Mm.
over I think that's in Britain somewhere, but like literally like tied to those roots. She'd been administering plant medicines and 5-MeO for 30 plus years.
Wow.
Comes through. I wish I remember her name because she actually looked like the fairy godmother. She was like this
Oh,
chubby little like medicine woman with all her little pouches and like feathers.
yeah. She's like, I'm about to take
Had,
you on a journey.
yeah, yep, yep. Had the accent, played all the instruments, the flutes and different things. So
Cool.
she came through, was like, I want to give you this experience. And of course I said, yeah, let's go. Locked down the studio and kind of had it. The studio was very much like a vortex, more or less, in itself.
Yeah.
And I designed it that way. So locked down the studio and really started a path working with toad venom for a while, and combo, actually, the frog poison.
Mm.
And through both of those, though combo is not psychedelic, it definitely brings you through the threshold of life and death, right? You do a high enough dose and it's like, okay, I am dying right now. This is the moment I die.
Yeah.
It's not fun. Have you used combo before? Or
No, I haven't.
no?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So it's very cleansing, right? It like
Yeah.
deeply, cleanses you out at the cellular level, but yeah, it is not for the faint of heart.
Mm.
Um, but at the same time, I was operating the breathwork studio
Mm-hmm.
and jumping into every one of our classes. Anytime I was there, I was in class. I just love the breath. And we'd pretty much, most of what we did at the studio was 3-part holotropic breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done holotropic or that style?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have, but you
Yeah.
could definitely explain it for the audience. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a super cushy practice, in my opinion, when people are like, oh, breath work. In fact, I don't use the word breath work most of the time, but people know
Mm.
it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, it's not work, especially, once you have a couple of big experiences with the breath, it's like, wow, I want to go back there. That was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Holotropic breath work, it was originally kind of like popularized by Stanislav Grof and his wife. And he's a psychiatrist author. And he was doing like actual research with LSD and breathing. I want to say like 70s, 80s were kind of like
Cool.
the heyday.
Mm-hmm.
And he developed this holotropic breathing, or at least popularized it. Holo means turning, and sorry, backwards. Holo means like whole, and
Mm-hmm.
tropic is like turning towards. So turning
Mm-hmm.
towards wholeness. And in this breath, you try and do most of the breathing through the mouth, but it's into the belly, into the chest, release. And you just kind of let the exhale fall out. And you do this laying down, head flat for 35 to 60 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it really induces a whole lot of different things. I have seen so many different, people coming through the studio that were processing grief or going through a life-threatening illness, or looking for creative inspiration, looking to get high, all these different types of use cases for this type of breath. So I've seen people, at the end of every session, every class, we would open up the room once we were all kind of sitting back up for any shares, anyone who wanted to kind of be seen, be heard, share their experience. And I've heard everything from like, I forgave my mother today, to like, I realized I need to leave my spouse, to I've got the name for the title for my book. So like this range is so wide.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so through the breath, and then that kind of combination, which wasn't intentional for me, but the combination of the combo and the bufo and the breath, death became the theme and the lesson for me. So it started as, birth and death are partners. They're in cahoots with each other. Then it was, wait, birth and death are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And then it kind of flipped. Death is the doorway to life. I just got shivers.
Yeah. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So back to the breath that you're talking about with your psychedelic, and that I can attest to as well, that breath, and particularly staying with the breath, we're kind of letting go of our relationship with time by being really fully in the moment. And in so doing, there's no fear of death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we were born. Yeah.
Yeah. I've really been immersing myself in similarly, like conceptualizing of this death portal, and in some very recent plant medicine journeys, like feeling how thin the veil is between 3D world, like our human bodies, and then spirits and consciousness that is no longer embodied, but is still, in just a realm unseen, and how accessible that is. And so really, really been intertwined intimately with death recently myself, and with it, in doing so, kind of feel this liberation in tandem with a little bit of that making sense of that depression we talked about earlier, but also this liberation in unprogramming and unlearning the fear that a lot of us just have embedded in us to die, and around death, when like you're saying, it's life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's been very profound for me to be in that space in the last little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like the universe just will hold the kind of pinchers on us until we finally get that. Like, I keep thinking, I've got it now. And then there's something I'm holding on to subconsciously. It could be approval. It could be any number of a million things that I'm holding on to. I'm like, I thought I got it. Got to let that go.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the journey, right? It's like you learn the lesson, and then you reintegrate into your life and just naturally old ways of being surface, or old neural pathways, if they're not fully rewired, trigger, rewire. And you find yourself kind of in this, what I find a lot is this, in a way, like shame of like, haven't I learned this? Haven't I been on this journey long enough to ultimately change this behavior or leave this behavior behind altogether? And it's the essence of being human, it's the coming back over and over again, and being on that spiral of, even though I'm still feeling the same through thread, I'm still ascending each time. I'm still bringing more awareness and more compassion and more of an ability to choose something different each time we find ourselves
Hmm.
in what might feel similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that it is a spiral-ish-ness.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
sometimes it can feel, I know I've struggled with feeling like a failure, like what's wrong with me? Why am I confronting
Yeah.
this lesson again? But
Right.
we're coming from a different vantage point. There's,
Hmm.
we are evolving, and that's
Hmm.
something that I don't know that we can escape. I don't know that even trying to evolve evolves us at this point. We
Mm.
are part of that process. And for me, and
Hmm.
this is something that resonated with me about your kind of conversation with your podcast, is the undoing in a way. And I might be paraphrasing here, but I'm not sure where I picked that up in your work. But this kind of like peeling of the onion, that the true, like all that we dream of being, all that we like golden shadow project onto the world
Hmm.
around us is actually within us. And and one of the reasons why the breath to me is so phenomenal is that not only does that deep like rhythmic breath work, like the practice of breath work, not only does that kind of liberate us from the conditions and slough off some of the weight of our, stuck emotions and emotional trauma and, mistaken sense of identity, but it also can be used through breath awareness without manipulating the breath to anchor us in the present moment. And when we're here in the moment, we are free and natural and powerful and all the things.
Right, right. We remember the
Hmm.
our power, our infinite potential. We have access to the quantum. It's like the present is where we create from. That's it.
Hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I want to dive more into kind of the futurist aspect of you. But before we go there, I'm curious if there are any myths or just like stories you hear about breathwork that you want to debunk.
Mm. One that comes to mind that, for me, there are schools in breathwork that will tell you like using your breath to get high is, BS, and you shouldn't do it.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
Even though that is in many cases a side effect of chemistry that's taking place in the body and in the nervous system, certain neuroendocrine cascades that can be very beneficial for our psychology.
mhm.
That, for example, if you're just doing Wim Hof, you're just hyperventilating, and it's some form of escapism. I see all of it as being valuable, really.
Mhm.
And for example, when you're doing Wim Hof breath, you're essentially hyperventilating. So you're off gassing oxygen,
Mhm.
which kind of counterintuitively is reducing um, oxygen in the blood. So you're actually increasing your CO2 because the oxygen is being off gassed,
Yeah.
which reduces blood flow to the frontal cortex of the brain,
Okay.
which is essentially where our rational mind lives, our
Yeah.
sense of location in the world, ultimately like our sense of separateness,
Mhm.
our overthinking, our, all the thoughts that give us anxiety and stress. So
Mhm.
isn't that a good thing to access? Like, I think so. Like, like I know
Yeah,
I need to turn down my thoughts a lot.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of this destigmatizing of getting high.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think there's an escapist getting high, right? And
Mhm.
alcohol is largely a kind of drug
Yeah.
that is almost entirely an escapist mechanism. But yeah, I think that it's a beautiful thing, because if we are both of these things, if we are nothing and something,
Mhm.
then, kind of dissolving ourselves into that nothing, I think is a very healthy practice to remember who we are.
Yeah, I agree with that. Cool. So,
Nice.
yeah, let's pivot a little bit into kind of the futurist aspect of your work, which I haven't come across often, even though these conversations, are so imperative to be having at this pivot point in our evolution as a collective with the introduction of AI. So, how do you see technology, AI, etc., shaping the evolution of consciousness?
That's a great question. We could do a whole podcast just on
Yeah.
that. So there was something that Deepak said. I heard him say it in like 2009 or 10. He was giving a lecture and he said, basically technology and I don't know if he said specifically AI at this time. I doubt he did, but technology is with us to stay. And it's important for particularly those of you in this room, people who are inclined towards, evolving their values, their morality, their spirituality, their emotional intelligence, etc. It's important that we are using technology because the future is essentially being created by that technology, and it's giving us leverage to have power in the world. And that to me is like the crux of the matter with like, oh, is AI going to destroy humanity? Or is it going to usher in a utopia? It's not the AI or the technology. It's the people who are deploying it and the consciousness of the people deploying it. So that definitely struck a chord. And around the time of that shower experience, I started getting very much into futurism and technology, also kind of like biohacking and self-optimization and all the things. But I would say that's one thing that I still to this day feel strongly about. If you do consider yourself, spiritual or seeking a life that is good, true, and beautiful, we need you to embrace technology, else we will end up in a cyberpunk dystopia, feudalist future. The other part is kind of looking at, and this is something that I'm writing about quite a bit lately to my subscribers and kind of parts of my book, The New Creator. We're shifting very, very rapidly, as we all can see, into a new age in which we're kind of given the opportunity to shift from human doings to human beings for real. So the soft skills, deep listening, being present with our lives. Ultimately, I see presence, what's kind of like vaguely considered presence, as being the number one kind of meta skill of the future. From that place, when we are present, we aren't in fear. We might be afraid of the car that's coming down the street. We're going to jump out, but we're not thinking about, debt collectors or stalkers, right, or, the world's perception of us or whatever. And that's where we need to be living from and creating from.
Yeah.
And deploying technology from, speaking our prompts. There's another aspect of it. A friend of mine just wrote a paper. It's not published yet, but it's called entheosemiotics. And entheo is that Greek word, I believe, that speaks to basically the God within. And then semiotics is like essentially language and symbol. And it's the idea that we can deploy semiotics through artificial intelligence and at this point, very much LLMs to paint the picture of a beautiful world, in a sense, like in a way, almost like pray it into being or like call it into being. And the power of words. Yeah.
Interesting. So almost creating, like collapsing a timeline using this technology, using the ability to write about it or paint the picture of it. You're almost bringing it into form.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. And there's a lot of really fascinating research throughout the 20th century on the power of image. There's a kind of an obscure textbook from a Dutch sociology professor. It's now pretty much out of print, but it's called The Image of the Future. And in it, there are a few things that he said that still, like, I basically memorized these little excerpts. He says, when the dominant images of the future, when the dominant images of a society are anticipatory, they lead social development and provide direction for social change. They have, as it were, a magnetic pull towards the future. So that kind of ties into that narrative, that cultural narrative.
Yeah. Which you arguably it's being done already. It's being done through media. It's being done through
Absolutely.
news. We're already being pulled toward a dominant narrative.
Hmm.
And it's just one that we aren't participating in. If we choose not to participate in it, but it's not one that we're necessarily choosing for our future, but it's one that's being given to us. And so you're saying that this power, or the power kind of our future, with more of an, I guess, more of an autonomous relationship with technology and with AI, can offer us more sovereignty in creating that dominant narrative.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
I mean, imagine what society would be like if the Terminator series never, was made. Like,
Yeah.
how would we orient AI if just that simple three-part movie series wasn't made? I
Yeah.
think it'd be a little bit different. I don't think there would be as much fear. And that,
Interesting. Yeah.
that painted a very vivid picture for us of what's possible
Mm-hmm.
with AI turned dark. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's important that we engage for that reason, like rather than sit back and let the media conglomerates and people with
Mm-hmm.
power continue to kind of shape the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part is, when we're present, we have more access to our resources. So we actually are, and there's science from Stanford and Harvard and other big universities on this. When we're in a state of coherence, we're making better decisions. So I would say that's probably like what I feel the world needs to start tuning into in
Yeah.
their relationship to AI.
Yeah. But I was actually looking at your, I don't know if it's a blog, but where you post all of your writing, and the article that I was drawn to that I read last night was about how what we need more of in present day and moving forward and into the future is presence as a creator.
Mm.
And it resonated with me because it is one of those things that felt so simple, but also so true, in that it's going to be, as you spoke about, those soft skills, the deep listening, the active listening, the more honed emotional,
Hmm.
empathy and ability to feel the energetics of any situation. It's, those are all things that we as humans are built to do. Those are what we are built to excel at, but we've been kind of numbed away from. We've been programmed out of by all of the distractions, by all the noise, by all the constant dopamine hits. Like, we've lost our ability to reside in those soft skills and use those as our superpowers.
Yeah.
And thus we've kind of created a society where we're leaning so much more into our hard skills, into our resumes, into our
Hmm.
achievements, into, look at all the things I've done, look at all the A's I got, look at all the money I've made, versus choosing our soft skills to also, be what brings you abundance or be those revenue portals, but trusting that those are what's going to be the differentiation as we move into an AI
Hmm.
world. Yeah, it was really fascinating, and I love just noodling on that. And again, what feels so simple, what feels so, and so when you're in your control, like, you don't have to go do anything. You don't have to achieve. Also, to your point of, we're moving more into that space of being versus doing. Like, we don't have to go out and, achieve more titles, or, keep doing. We can release into the being, and that's going to be the superpower. It feels really,
Hmm.
it feels very motivating and also empowering. Like, that's in your control. You can cultivate that presence. You don't need money.
Yes,
You don't need anything other than your willingness to essentially develop a practice.
absolutely. And you've already got it. You've already got all those things
Hmm.
that you need. I think the other aspect to that is, we've been saying for I don't know how long, we tell kids, if you could do anything and you knew you couldn't fail, what would you do?
Hmm. Yeah.
This question is really getting real.
Yeah.
With natural language, we're within a few years of being able to just speak to a device or to our home and, manifest a product or a business or a brand or a movement. So really like tuning into that, like what am I, like kind of ikigai style, like what do I really feel strongly about that brings my passion, my skills, the market? What does the world need that I can bring successfully to the world? We're moving towards an era where, I think the guys at OpenAI are betting on when we'll see the first $1 billion one person business.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, if that's an indication, to me, that's an indication of where we're headed, meaning that, none of us are going to be employees in the future. It's all going to be technology. We're all going to be CEOs of our lives and of our creations. And so starting to like prepare for that and go, okay, like this is the businesses that I'm building right now are all like, I'm not doing it if it's not technologies. I'm not hiring anybody, right? It's just, it's all vertical. It's all AI or another contractor. And yeah, we're kind of moving in that direction. So thinking about like, what is my voice? What does my soul really want to share with the world?
Yeah.
Because yeah, now's the time.
And do you think there's space for every individual to be a CEO and to be, have their own multiple offerings? Like, I'm just curious what that landscape looks like. It's so interesting to think about. But do you think there's space for that?
I think that's a great question, and I have no idea.
Yeah.
I hope there is. So when you think about like, they're saying the kind of tech forecasters are saying essentially everything is going to be pennies. So everything is eventually going to be almost free. I imagine that there will be, there's still a massive, the vast majority of humans that aren't creators, right? That aren't business owners, creators. And yeah, there's going to be, I definitely think that at this point, I used to think it was a potential. I now think that it's going to be necessary for UBI. But it may be that eventually, everything becomes so cheap that we can essentially transact, and that marketplace becomes much more rich, that we're I might meet you in a virtual space and you share your wisdom or art or insight with me, and it costs me 3 pennies, but that's your, let's say it's your virtual avatar, your digital avatar that's transacting with 1 million people in that same moment.
Interesting. Yeah.
I have no idea though. It's a great question.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about all of the essentially like identity shedding that needs to take place for people who have been in employee roles and have been programmed to be an employee, to be told to do a certain thing, to have a deadline, to report back, to clock in at this time, clock out at this time, to then be given this amount of freedom or like, space to create. That's a whole identity shift in of itself, to be able to be seen and to be able to, give yourself space to be creative. And so, yeah, it's a fun thought experiment just to think about where this will take humanity. And there's so much more we could talk about, but I want to be mindful of time, and I want to finish off with a quick lightning round if you're open to it. Just 4 questions.
Let's
just
do it.
whenever. Cool. Okay, so number 1, a myth you feel we need to reawaken today.
I feel like my answer is a little cliche, but the hero of 1,000 faces, the hero within each and every one of us. Above the archetypes, all of those archetypes are a part of us. Each one of us has a mission and a quest.
Cool.
And
I love that.
And a magic to bring back to the tribe.
Yeah, I love that. I don't even think anything's cliche anymore. Like, things are cliche because they're true. So love that.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
A breath practice you return to often.
I will often do 10 deep breaths through my nose, and I'll hold at the top for about 10 to 20 seconds and then release. This is, in my experience, the fastest way to kind of reset to baseline. So just 10 10 kind of slow, full, deep breaths through the nose, all the way in, full, and then hold on the last one at the top, and then release.
Beautiful. Love that. A book that cracked you open.
So many. One of my favorites that I've got to mention is, it's the most impactful book on my life, is called As a Man Thinketh. Are you familiar with that?
No.
James Allen. It was written in like 1890 or 1894. Beautiful little poetic book on the power of our psychology to create our reality.
Cool. As a Man Thinketh.
Yep.
Okay. And one thing that most people misunderstand about transformation.
I've lately felt strongly about that. The pursuit of transformation can fortify a subconscious belief that we are not enough as we are. And I know for me, I spent more than a decade even pushing that narrative in my business. Always be evolving, always be becoming. But I think these days, more than anything, that becoming is through being.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. And I think that's something I often have to bring awareness to in my own practices, whether I find myself in a space of rigidity with my routines or my meditation practices, and really being radically honest with myself of whether I'm approaching my practices from a space of fear or from a space of needing to maintain a certain pace of transformation, right? And instead, and being radically honest when that is the case. And when that's the case, giving myself the opportunity and the permission to let go, like definitely maintain my meditation practice, but let go of the rigidity around it, let go of how it looks, let go of needing to have certain breakthroughs or, anything, just really being in the practice and trusting that the transformation is in the being. So I love that. I think that's all a reminder we need.
Yeah. And just to echo that a little deeper, through making choices that feel good, through putting more attention on our interoceptive intelligence and going, does this conversation feel good, this relationship, this project, whatever it is, really being tuned into that and doing really what our heart desires. I think that's the way.
Yeah, I think so too. And I love that reminder, and like honing that communication, or that relationship to self, so that you can really tune into that feeling in your body when something doesn't feel good, when something does feel good. And the hardest part in that, once you've honed that relationship to the somatic body, essentially, to feel that, is deciding to kind of not do something if it doesn't feel good, and like that courage to move against the grain of what maybe where you think you should be going, or where somebody's ushering you, and really listening to your own guidance. That's where the magic happens. That's also where the most, that's where the most courage is necessary.
Yeah, it doesn't feel safe.
No.
When we're getting to know that move, it's like, oh, I might upset that person.
Yeah, or what if something else doesn't come through? What if this doesn't feel good? But what if I'm missing an opportunity? There's so many ways that the mind can come in and convince you to play safe. I think it's something we all have to be cognizant of in our human experience. So
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Leo. Will you please share how my audience can stay in touch with you, stay in touch with your wisdom and your work?
Oh, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So I do quite a bit of writing these days. If you go to leomars.com, that's with 2 R's, leomars.com, you can kind of see everything I've got going on there. You can also get on my email list if you're interested. I typically send an email every Saturday. It's pretty much all just value and insight and practices. So
Sweet. Love that. Well, yeah, thank you again for your time and your presence. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And yeah,
Yeah,
thank
thank you,
you.
Kat. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening and sharing this space with us today. If Leo's words resonated with you, his view of transformation through presence, the bridge between death and breath, or his vision of the future, I encourage you to check out his work at leomars.com, join his newsletter. He sends out powerful weekly reflections. I am a part of the community, and it's a beautiful way to stay connected to his insights. As always, if you found value in this episode, share it with someone you love, leave a review, or tag me in your reflections. And remember, the breath is always here. The moment is always enough, and you are already whole. All right, guys, have a beautiful week. I will be back next week with another episode.